Hello children. Today we will learn lesson number 20 from your Sunday school book. The name of the chapter is Elisha, the man of miracles. It is the continuation of the last chapter we learned. In the previous chapter we saw how Elisha was anointed the prophet of God by Elijah and how Elisha completely submitted to the will of God. We also saw how Elijah was taken away by God and Elisha received what he desired the most, that is the double portion of the Spirit. The mighty power in Elisha was visible from the moment he returned from his master, receiving a double portion of his Spirit. Now we will see what are the miracles done through Elisha in his prophetic ministry. Please, children, remember to go through the portion to read. 2 Kings chapter 2 from verse 10. Jordan was divided. This was the first miracle done by Elisha. Elisha picked up the mantle which Elijah had cast off when he went up to heaven. He felt the spirit of Elijah within him, and when he had to cross the Jordan to return home, he waved Elijah's mantle against the water, and they parted suddenly and made a way for the divine prophet to cross the Jordan on its dry bed. The second miracle was healing the source of water in Jericho. Now the people of Jericho came to him to complain about bad water in the vicinity, which caused disease to man and beast, and laid the whole land waste and barren. Elisha went to the nearest spring, and there he cast some salt into the water. And to the assembled people he proclaimed in God's name that the water would now be cured and would no longer cause death nor make the land barren. And as the people drank of the sweet, pure, and wholesome water, they praised God and blessed the great prophet. Elisha's name grew far and wide. Mauling of 42 youths by 2 female bears in Bethel. Having left Jericho in the company of his disciples, the younger prophets, Elisha was approaching the town of Bethel. Instead of greeting the prophet and his disciples with respect and honor, some young men of Bethel came out to mock the prophet and shout abusive words in his direction. Well, the reason for their disgraceful behavior was their great selfishness, because Elisha cured the water and they used to do business with that water. They used to bring water from afar and get high prices for it from the local inhabitants. And since Elisha cured the water, they lost this business and therefore hated the prophet. Seeing that these people had no fear of God and no respect for the prophet, nor any consideration for their fellow men, Elisha cursed them, and their punishment came swiftly. Ferocious bears suddenly appeared from the woods and charged into the mocking crowd. 42 young men were left slain, and rest fled in terror. Israel got water in the battle against the Moabites. 3 kings came together to Elisha to ask his help. The occasion was the war with Moab. For many years, the Moabites had been subdued by Ahab, the king of Israel. Now, when Ahab died, they rebelled and again became a menace, a problem to the people of Israel. So Ahab's son Jehoram, Jehoshaphat, king of Judah, and king of Edom went to war with their armies against Moab. But when the armies were ready and poised for battle against the Moabites, they ran out of water, and they became faint with thirst. There was not a drop of water in the whole valley, and it looked as though the vast armies of the 3 kings would suffer a great disaster. The 3 kings then remembered Elisha and together went to see him. Elisha told them, in God's name, to dig ditches. And though they would see neither wind nor rain, the ditches would be filled with pure drinking water for them and their horses. Moreover, Elisha promised them that they will have victory over the Moabites. Every word Elisha said came true. Multiplies the oil for the widow of the servant of a prophet. One day the widow of the prophets, Obadiah, came to Elisha. In a voice full of grief, she told him that her husband died in great indebtedness, and the creditors now threatened to take away her 2 sons as slaves unless she paid the debts immediately. Elisha had known the God-fearing and kind Obadiah, who under the very eyes of the wicked king Ahab fed and sheltered the true prophets of God, whom the wicked queen Jezebel sought to exterminate. He sustained them at his own expense, and when his own means gave out, he had to incur many debts. Now his 2 sons would have to serve the creditors, for such was the law in those days. Surely such a man deserves a better lot. Elisha asked her, "What have you in the house?" "I have nothing but a little pot of oil, sir," she replied. "Good. Now go and borrow many vessels from your neighbors. The more, the better. Then shut yourselves in with your sons and pour the oil into the vessels." Then women followed the prophet's instructions. When she began to pour out some oil into the first vessel, the oil kept on pouring until the vessel was full. The boys passed her the next vessel, and this too soon became full of oil. Vessel after vessel was thus filled with oil, and the little oil that was originally in the pot never seems to end. When all the vessels were filled, she cried to the boys to pass her another vessel, but they said there were no empty vessel left. Immediately the oil stopped. The women ran to Elisha and told him what happened. Elisha was not surprised. He told her to sell all the oil and repay her husband's debts, and use the rest to support her and her children. The women of Shunem got her son resurrected. One day he visited the town of Shunem. There lived an aged couple there, and both of them were very kind and pious. The aged couple were so pleased with the great privilege they had to welcome this prophet that they thought of building a special chamber for him. They built a special chamber and put a bed there with a table and a stool and a candlestick, so that whenever the prophet passed through Shunem, he would find a ready little resting room. So Elisha was quite moved with this gesture, and he asked her, what can he do for her? How can he reward her for her kindness? She said, "I don't need anything, for I have everything in my house." Elisha came to know that this aged couple, they don't have a child. So he promised them a son. Exactly at the time predicted by the prophet Elisha, a son was born to the aged couple. And one day when the boy was a few years old, he died, and the poor mother went up to Elisha and cried at his feet. Elisha himself then went to the house of the Shunammite and shut himself up with the dead child. Uttering a prayer to God, he restored the child to life. And children, this very child was later to become the prophet Habakkuk. Removes the poison from the stew. Now Elisha returned to Gilgal, and there was a famine in that region. While the company of the prophets was meeting with him, he said to his servant, "Put on the large pot and cook some stew for these men." He went out to the field to gather some herbs. He came back with some wild gourds, and no one knew that they were poisonous. When he made the stew, and when the prophets started eating the stew, they cried, "O man of God, there's death in the pot." Elisha requested a handful of meal, and he poured it into the pot. Then he invited the young prophets to eat some more. They did, and suffered no ill effects. Feeds 100 men with 20 loaves of bread. Sometime later, a man came from Baal-Shalisha in Mount Ephraim, bringing a present to the prophet. It was the bread of his first fruit, 20 barley loaves and some ears of corn. Said Elisha to his attendant, "Give it all to the people gathered here." "There are 20,000 of your disciples here," the man exclaimed in amazement. "Shall I set one loaf before hundreds of men?" "Give it to them," said the holy man again, "for this is the word of God. They will eat and leave thereof." And so it was. They all ate and had enough, and some of the bread was left over. Heals Naaman's leprosy. A Gentile man named Naaman was commander of king of Aram's army. Even though Naaman was powerful and victorious, he had one problem. He was a leper. During one of the raids on Israel, a little girl was captured by this person, and she became a servant to Naaman's wife. When the girl saw Naaman's leprosy, she told her mistress about the prophet of Elisha. Naaman went to meet Elisha, but Elisha did not come out to greet Naaman. Instead, he sent Naaman a message instructing him to wash in the Jordan River 7 times to be healed. Naaman was furious. He had expected Elisha to treat him like a very important person and perform a special healing ritual over him. He wasn't going to do something as simple as bathing, he thought. He left Elisha's house in a huff. But his servant reasoned with him and got him to do as Elisha had said. Naaman plunged himself into the Jordan. After the 7th time, his leprosy was gone. Naaman returned to Elisha a little more humble than when he had left. "Now I know there is no God in all the earth except in Israel," he said to Elisha. And from that day on, Naaman worshipped only God. Cursed Gehazi, who became a leper. A servant of the prophet Elisha, Gehazi enjoyed a position of power but was ultimately corrupt. Misusing his authority to cheat Naaman the Syrian, a general afflicted with leprosy. As punishment, Elisha cursed Gehazi, transferring Naaman's leprosy to him and his descendants forever. Floated the iron axe head of the sons of prophet. So numerous did Elisha's disciples become that their quarters in Samaria became too small. At the request of the young prophets, Elisha gracefully agreed to accompany them to the Jordan, where they intended to build spacious quarters to house all the young prophets who were anxious to be near him. Once again, Elisha amazed the young prophets by a wonderful miracle. It happened that the iron head of an axe used by one of the builders in cutting down a tree fell into the waters of the Jordan. The young prophet was greatly distressed because the axe was borrowed. Seeing how dear the young prophet held the property of his friend, Elisha came to his rescue. He cut a wooden stick and threw it into the water. And the next moment, all the young prophet gazed at a wonderful sight. The wooden stick slowly sank to the bottom, and up came the iron to the surface and was retrieved by the young prophet. Elisha reveals the thoughts of the king of Syria, and he also prayed to God to open the eyes of his servant so that he can see the heavenly vision. Now, the king of Syria was at war with Israel. He consulted his officers and chose a place to set up his camp. But Elisha sent word to the king of Israel, warning him not to go near that place, because the Syrians were waiting in ambush there. So the king of Israel warned the people who lived in that place that they were on guard. This happened several times. The Syrian king became greatly upset over this. He called in his officers and asked them, "Which one of you is on the side of king of Israel?" One of them answered, "No one is, your majesty. The prophet Elisha tells the king of Israel what you say even in the privacy of your room. Find out where he is," the king ordered, "and I will capture him." When he was told that Elisha was in Dothan, he sent a large force there with horses and chariots. They reached the town at night and surrounded it. Early the next morning, Elijah's servant got up, went out of the house, and saw the Syrian troops with their horses and chariots surrounding the town. He went back to Elijah and exclaimed, "We are doomed, sir. What shall we do?" "Don't be afraid," Elijah answered. "We have more on our side than they have on theirs." Then he prayed, "O Lord, open his eyes and let him see." The Lord answered his prayers, and Elijah's servant looked up and saw the hillside covered with horses and chariots of fire all around Elisha. When the Syrian attacked, Elisha prayed, "O Lord, strike these people with blindness." The Lord answered his prayer and struck them blind. Then Elisha went to them and said, "You're on the wrong road. This is not the town you're looking for. Follow me and I will lead you to the man you are after." And he led them to Samaria. As soon as they had entered the city, Elisha prayed, "Open their eyes, Lord, and let them see." The Lord answered his prayer, and he restored their sight, and they saw that they were inside Samaria. Prophecy about the unusual increase in barley came true. Now there was a great famine in the land of Israel and Samaria. God's promise through Elisha was that in 24 hours, the economic situation in Samaria would be completely reversed. Instead of scarcity, there would be such abundance that food prices would radically drop in the city. How did this happen? Let's see. Now there were 4 leprous men, and these men stayed at the entrance of the gate because they were not welcome in the city. They would soon die from the famine, they thought, if they stayed by the city. If any food becomes available, they would certainly be the last to receive it. So they decided that their chances were better if they surrendered to the Syrians. Now the Syrian had a huge army that surrounded the city of Samaria for many months, and the camp was the home and supply center for thousands of men. When they had come to the outskirts of Syrian camp, the lepers were surprised that no one were there. So the lepers went into one tent, they ate and drank, and after some time they called to the gatekeepers of the city. Then the people went out and plundered the tents of Syrian. And thus the prophecy of Elisha came true. Foresaw the 7 years of famine. Time and again, Elijah warned his people to mend their ways or suffer famine and war. The people did not mend their ways, and the famine came just as Elisha had foretold it. Reveal the heart of Hazael to himself. One day Elijah went to Damascus, the capital of Syria. The news of his arrival in the Syrian capital reached King Ben-Hadad, who was lying critically ill in his palace. The king sent his most trusted statesman, Hazael, to inquire of the Hebrew prophet whether he would recover from his illness. Elisha told him that the king would not die of his illness, but he would die by some other means. And turning his head to the wall, the prophet wept bitterly. Hazael asked, "O man of God, why are you weeping?" Elisha said to him, "God has revealed to me that you will be the next king of Syria, and that you will cause unspeakable misery and suffering to my people." Hazael returned to his king and told him only that the prophet had said that king would not die of his illness. The next morning, however, when he was alone with the sick king, he smoothed him and proclaimed himself king of Syria. Prophecy at the time of his death. After 50 years of ministry, Elijah gets affected by a disease and he was confined to the bed. Then Joash, the king of Israel, came to him crying. Elijah asked him to take his bow and arrow. The king held his hand over the arrow, and Elijah placed his hand on the king's hand. They opened the east window and shot the arrow, saying that it was the arrow of the Lord's deliverance from Syria. He then asked the king to strike another arrow on the ground. He struck it thrice. The prophet told the king that he would defeat the Syrian thrice. Then he died and was buried. In the next year, a dead body revived and stood up when it was unknowingly thrown into the tomb of Elisha and touched his bones. Thus, Elisha was a storehouse of divine miracles. Specialities of Elisha's life. First, Elisha dressed himself in the rough dress suited for the desert life. Elisha wore the dress of common people. Elisha's dress, his deeds, were very different from Elijah. He was an epitome of spiritual zeal. He left everything and followed his master when he received his calling. He prophesied in authority, and he was with full assurance about God's word. He also lived a very victorious spiritual life. His character was without any blemish or guile. His vision was very strong, and he gained the testimony from all of being a holy man. He was also a teacher. He served in more than one school for the prophets. Now, children, let us compare our life with that of Elisha's and consecrate ourselves to receive the double portion of the Spirit. Now we have come to the end of this chapter, children. I hope this chapter was a blessing to you. Elisha dedicated his life to God, and God used him mightily for his work. In the similar manner, we should also dedicate our life to God, and God will use us mightily for his honor. Thus, I conclude this lesson. I hope to see you with a new chapter in the coming week. Thank you for viewing this video. Be safe, be at home. God bless you all.